Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where we talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Arrow, as well as the latest episode of Legends of Tomorrow. Like always, if I'm talking about something you want to listen to, you can always look in the description down below. I include a time when I start talking about each of the respective shows. So, for example, if you don't want to hear what I had to say about this week's episode of Arrow, you can skip to what I had to say about this week's episode of Legends of Tomorrow. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is this week's episode of Arrow. A lot of interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. It seems like the overarching theme of this episode, and it might be just kind of overarching theme of the season in general, is like doing whatever it takes, crossing lines that you normally probably wouldn't have. Because literally every storyline in this episode, and probably if you look back, probably every storyline in the other two episodes is like this too, but it's like willingness to do whatever it takes for the respective reasons, because obviously we have Lila, John, and Curtis going on a mission. It's like, oh, they're gathering information for Argus, but it turns out Lila copied the information, because for her it's like a situation of like people at Argus aren't doing, like, she goes to them about like there's some greater plot here, which I'm wondering in any shape or form could this circle back to Hive in some shape or form, because we have not dealt with that organization since they like popped up in 4 when Damien Dark was working with them. So that's still an option that's still kind of set out there. But basically it's like she's seeing a lot of money moving around. It seems like the biggest thing Argus could go up against, but the fact of the matter is the higher ups aren't listening to her because she doesn't have enough proof. So she's kind of handling a lot of stuff off book. She's kind of going all vigilante herself, which John's biggest issue is like, you didn't tell me. But the fact of the matter is it's also like you're doing this behind Argus's back, which she's like, I thought you, of anybody, would understand, Mr. I was like working with a vigilante and was a vigilante for so long, kind of going outside of the system, that basically there are some lines you have to cross yourself. And so that turns into that situation of, I don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thing, because it's like, because Lila was like, I understand, I respect the fact that you don't want to pick up the mantle, but it's still like, this is something she feels like, because what Oliver represented, I think still, it kind of, like, everything that Oliver represented as a Green Arrow and vigilantes in general, I think instilled something in her, where she, now that she's the head of Argus, she looks at it and realizes just how much terrible stuff is out there that just kind of faltered, like, that the law doesn't really catch up to just because they're not aware of it, and there's all of this bureaucratic red tape they have to go through. So she's trying to handle this on her own, but you have John be like, when the time comes, like, if this comes up, like, be honest and open with me and let me help you, let me know what's going down. Which I don't remember if John Jr. brought up like what happened to his mom, Lila, in the future. And like I said, it's been a long time since I saw that episode of Legends. I don't even know if they really went into it too much. I think Diggle is gone, but I mean, to be fair, we're fiddling with time like all across the board. Like, I mean, we do have we have a show like Legends, plus anything Flash related time travel. I mean, obviously that's going to be something that they're going to try to avoid, but still there's that whole situation of like, well, what does that mean, Because obviously you have this storyline this season dealing with the future, and like what that, like, I've already put out there last episode what I thought all this could really mean, about like whoever the Green Arrow is. It's most likely William from the future come back in time, but it could just as easily be John, because John was the last Green Arrow we saw. I mean, for all because I doubted it's Oliver, but that could strongly still be a possibility too. But my money's more so on William, but nevertheless. So that's the whole situation of like, this makes me wonder, like, okay, so what about Lila and John? Is this going to be the situation that ends up taking them from John Jr.? I don't know. We'll kind of have to wait and see. At the very least, it might be something that leads to Lila getting taken away from them, but we'll see in the long run. On the other side of things, we have Felicity, and I think it's such an interesting thing what they're doing Felicity this season, because Felicity is actually becoming a lot more like Oliver in the sense of she's willing to do whatever it takes. She goes to Watson about the whole situation. Watson's kind of like not budging, but for her, for Felicity, it's like, you locked my husband up and you're not holding up your end of the deal. It's like, my husband sacrificed so much to protect this city for 6 years. It cost him a lot. Like, Oliver lost a lot to his battle, like trying to protect Star City. And it's kind of like, and yet a monster like Diaz is able to just roam free. That's not justice. And even Watson kind of, like, obviously Felicity bugged her office, was even kind of surprised, like, wow, I guess Watson isn't all bad. But she's not. Like, she's a stickler for justice, but at the same time, even she recognizes the danger that is, Ricardo Diaz and stuff like that. So it's just, because it's actually even more heartbreaking because you have Felicity be like, basically, everything's ruined because of that deal you made. Because it's like, now my son is being sent away and my husband's in jail. Like, it's not just my life that got messed up, but it's also the city because the city doesn't have Oliver protecting it like it should. So there's that interesting perspective on it. And Felicity gets Renee on her side. Like I said, showing that she is crossing the line more and more, but they openly go to Dinah and Watson for help with this whole situation. It's like they need to get to the CDC because that's what Diaz is after. And I even love, like, she's like, yeah, could we, Silencer's the one that hacked into, everything. And then, like, is that what we're calling her, Silencer? And then, like, Felicity is like, yeah, it's better than Belt Lady. And Renee's like, noted. So that situation turned into what it did. Also, you got to admit, like, Agent Watson is able to handle herself pretty nicely in a fight. But sadly, things didn't kind of go out the way they did. And once again, I bring up the aspect of I love that being a thing, like Silencer, like fighting Silencer. I guess, like, because Dinah never actually tried to use her power. I guess, like, because she is by herself, she knows it wouldn't work. The only reason why it worked last time is because her and Laurel were working together. So that kind of took Silencer down. Well, it seems like her name's Honor, but we'll just call her Silencer right now. I'm perfectly fine with that. So what I thought was kind of interesting about that, obviously, like, Felicity was kind of like, okay, Renee, because blocks out both Dinah and Agent Watson. Because I think that's the interesting step, too, there. She didn't even include Dinah in this because Dinah and Agent Watson want to handle this the very lawful way because, they both believe in the system, because that's the whole thing about vigilantes and stuff like that. It's like, oh, you undermine the system. That's something that kind of got brought up about from York's perspective last episode about Oliver and the whole Green Arrow situation. And so they still kind of believe in the system, and it's kind of like, leave it to the system to do this. It's like, this is the right way to handle things anyway. It's like, it's also the whole, like, immunity agreement is kind of a factor in it, but it's more so like, let it be shown that the city can protect itself, that it doesn't need outside law, people outside the law to handle it, So that was just kind of interesting. And so Felicity had what would help Watson. Like, it could have easily been a situation of like, no, we can work together, because all Watson needed was some proof that, like, information about this whole Diaz situation to go to her bosses. But with them keeping Silencer to themselves, like, she ends up getting transferred because she gets in trouble because they came up with nothing. And it's like, and that's even something Renee comments on. I think it's so fascinating. It's like, even Renee's, because Felicity is like, no, this is how is this any different from what we normally do? It's like, oh, Agent Watson made her choice by, she made that decision herself. We didn't force her. And it's like, that's a little cold-hearted, to an extent. But I think that's the point, to show you how far Felicity's willing to go. She's willing to do and willing to sacrifice anybody. I mean, granted, not like Agent Watson died, but you could tell she kind of felt a little bad about it. But I think at the end, it's just like getting her family back together and taking Diaz down it's so interesting, because I feel like it's so kind of reflective of kind of what Oliver was doing last season, kind of cutting people out, trying to go back to basics, trying to handle things alone. Obviously, she's got Renee's help, but still, it's like she's kind of like this driving force on her own. She's a lot like Oliver kind of in season 1, too, and I think that's kind of something we can kind of see reflecting in this, like, because she feels like that's the only way to get progress in this situation, like, is to take Diaz down her way, because no one else's way is working. Argus couldn't do it, the FBI couldn't do it, SCPD couldn't do it. So for her, it's like, there has to be another way, and this is her way. Because even to the point, it's like, okay, we're capturing her, but it's like, even the whole vigilante thing is like, is this really how we would do it? Because they never captured and tortured people like that. Obviously, that's something Oliver has done in the past and stuff like that. So that's why it's kind of like, yeah, normally we capture a bad guy and we hand it over to the cops. Like, hey, like, we could hand this over to Dinah, but, Felicity doesn't want that. Could have handed it over to Watson. That could have been good, because you could have had, like, an agency backing you up. Even had the aspect of, like, Watson asking Felicity if she'd ever kind of go back to, like, putting her skills, her tech skills to, like, good use, instead of just kind of existing outside of the law. But she's kind of done this for so long, prior, not just the whole 6 years working with, like, Oliver and all of this, but also, like, the whole aspect of, like, oh yeah, she was like her activist days back in the day too. So, like I said, it was just an interesting perspective to see, that come about for Felicity's character. So I'm interested to see like how far down the rabbit hole she ends up going this season in her desperation. Because we see that even reflected in Oliver too, in a sense of Oliver, made that deal with York. I mean, that situation with York happened, and Brick's like, oh yeah, the person you want to get information from is the demon. They kind of set up a lot of stuff in here. I'm kind of the middleman in that type of situation. Turns out that was kind of, borderlining a lie, because it was all meant to be like Brick sending Turner to kill him. And that ended up turning into an interesting thing. Well, for one, Oliver's such a badass. Even wounded, he kicked all of those dudes' asses, including Turner's. And I thought was kind of interesting was kind of like later on the conversation of Turner being like, you want to act like I'm like some bad guy. Like, the fact of the matter is, I helped what was essentially the Suicide Squad episode of like Arrow earlier on in the show's history, and he was like, I saved Lila, and it's like, and Oliver's like, John never mentioned that. He's like, of course he would, because like, you guys only see me as a criminal, which is like, yeah, you've done a lot of terrible things, but it's like, you've seen me one way, because he's like, you don't know me, just like they don't really know Oliver. Like, no one knows the full story of everything that Oliver went through over the course of just the Lian Yu situation and all that. So, but there was even that fact is of him fighting Samson. He did that, what was that sick kind of like jump, kind of cartwheel, and then he like dropped, like, I don't know what you'd call that move. It's so sick. He hit him with his feet, like, after doing a cartwheel like that, and then like eventually breaking his arm, which is like kind of shit. Even the dude that's with him is like, dude, that was sick, Oliver, because it turned into like a Brick running like a fight club, which the guards are kind of in on in a sense. But turns out the demon doesn't exist. He isn't locked up on that level. He's actually on lower levels, which goes, okay, so Oliver beats up some guards, even slashing them up with a knife, just because he's that intent on going to the lower level. Even had this moment of just kind of like, even Turner kind of lowering his head, like almost like, it almost seemed like out of almost respect, because he realizes just how far Oliver's willing to go to protect his family, which I guess even with their differences, even he realizes, I guess for him, it's kind of like, he even said himself, like, him and Oliver aren't really that different. And I guess that kind of, there was like this honorable moment of just kind of like, that's how I interpreted it, as him being like, oh, I see your determination type of thing. I don't know, but that was kind of interesting. He's kind of leaving his buddy behind, which I'm kind of sad about that, which I'm also kind of like, I guess because I was throwing it out there the past two episodes, like, I don't know if I 100% trust that guy, but it's like, okay, he's kind of left to his own vices, and Oliver's being taken to level 2, which is like, yeah, apparently very, very bad. I wonder, is there anyone he's crossed path with as the Arrow down there? Obviously we got like Samson, Turner, and Brick, which they're villains that pop up so infrequently. They popped up from time to time that I legitimately forgot their names until they actually said them in the episode. But also the fact of the matter is I'm just terrible with names in general. But yeah, it's kind of pretty interesting. I'm curious to find out, for one, who this demon is. Is it going to be someone we know? Or what's going to happen in that regard, and like who else Oliver's going to run into down there. When he gets the information he needs to get, I'm curious to see what Oliver will ultimately do, because like I said, it's just this huge paradigm shift in just a lot of people, like their desperation to do whatever they need to because of just their desperation to take out Diaz, which I almost let it slip my mind to talk about too, is the fact is that Diaz, the compound he stole from the CDC, he's like, the fact of the matter is he's been in pain ever since he got blown off the building and hit the water last season from when Laurel blasted him. And it hitting the water that hard shattered almost every bone in his body. But he's like, even with all that pain, which is like, man, you were in, like, I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because like, that's always kind of his deal of like, he turns his pain into a weapon, because like, even being in as much pain as he is, you wouldn't think so, because he seemed like so together. So, but it seems like he injects himself because he's like, I'm going to turn that pain into something else, because I've been patient, waiting for an opportunity. And we see him, after he injected himself, punch the wall and kind of break it. And it just seems like he's like got superhuman strength at this point. So part of me was wondering, like, did he make what is an equivalency to the Murakuru serum? I'm wondering, did he make something to that near specifics in that regard, or is it something else entirely? Because I don't really know much about him in the comic books, so I don't know if it's like he typically has superhuman strength in the comic books and stuff like that. it probably isn't just some crazy like, oh, he's got superpowers now. It's probably more so like it just like buffed him up in some shape or form. So that's going to make him a lot more dangerous to cross paths with. So like I said, I'm very interested to see where all this takes us, especially like the Felicity Renee situation. Like I said, because even Renee's kind of like, I don't know about this, but Felicity pushing forward. I'm curious to see like what lengths she's willing to go through to see this through, what Oliver ends up experiencing on level 2, and what happens with this whole Dago and Lila situation. Like whatever it is or whoever it is that she's investigating, what that turns into. We'll just have to wait to the next episode to see if we get any answers about a lot of that. And now moving on to this week's episode of Legends of Tomorrow. Quite a few things went down this episode, so let's break everything down. Obviously, we have the team heading to Salem, Massachusetts during the Salem witch trials, and Constantine's coming along, which I immediately love him just being like, okay, so be coming along, I'm gonna set some rules. For one, I'm not gonna wear any stupid costume. Two, the fact of the matter is, I want all the benefits, and I also want 2 weeks paid vacation. And Zari's like, paid, which is an interesting thing because that comes up because Nate actually has no money in this episode, which is like, right. And I think that's kind of a joke across all the shows, except for Supergirl, because Kara actually has a job. Everyone else, at more often than not throughout their respective shows, didn't really have money. So it's like, how are you funding, Star Labs or Team Arrow, for example? So there's those type of situations. But like, Kara's like always had a consistent job, so it's always that. But it's like, yeah, the Legends, they wouldn't, because they don't get paid for what they do. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, you never really need money anyway, because it's not like you stay anywhere. You live on the ship, the Wave Rider, and Gideon kind of gives you everything you need. So like, money's never really been an issue. I even love that it's like, oh yeah, you have a credit card that expired in 1953. It's like, why am I even carrying that around? Like, I want to know what the circumstances were around that you had that. That was kind of interesting. But yeah, that kind of, like, I'm sure that's why Zara's kind of like, paid? None of us are getting paid for this. Why would you, out of anybody, get paid? But I also love that it ends with like Rory and like Constantine constantly bumping into each other and just like not liking each other, because they are like the least team players of them all, even though like Rory's actually kind of more of a softie, like especially as the series is going on, he's more and more of a team player, even though he tries to act like a solo artist. I think that's where him and John will probably like get along while at the same time butt heads about. So they're kind of like the misfits amongst the misfits type of thing. But, the rest of the team ain't, falling behind themselves. They're pretty close in that race of misfitness, which is weird for me to say. Nevertheless, the whole situation revolves around a woman named Jane who is going to be executed, and that ends with like the town burning on fire and stuff like that. That's obviously to change history and stuff like that. But Jane, even in the original time frame, ends up getting executed. So it's not like the mystical creature that's here changed anything. So it's that whole situation of like, well, what do you do? Because Zari obviously is the one who pushes the most for like trying to find loopholes around situations. Like, no, things have changed, because it's the whole thing of like, they just fixed time. The last thing they want to do is because for one, you don't know the ripple effects of like what that could ultimately do. And it's like, we just fixed time. Let's not go through the trouble of ripping it apart again. We made such an effort to not screw that up again. So they're working in that regard. But Zari is coming from a situation of like, she looks at this time period and it's very reflective of her time period. Just because you're different, because of who you are, Argus kind of likes you. Because like, let's not forget, like, they're super against like people with powers and stuff like that. So, as well as other things. But I think that was kind of like the main thing. They locked up metahumans, even though like Zari's situation doesn't fall under that category. Her power comes from totems and stuff like that. But still, there is a whole situation. Well, I think that just kind of applies to anyone with powers in general, no matter what the circumstances would have been. But she sees that same world existing in the past, and she wants to do something about it, because she couldn't do anything about her own respective situation. At the very least, like, hey, maybe I can do something about Prudence's situation, even promising like, hey, we can help you out. We can save your mom, knowing, but ultimately they can't. And that bothers Zari the most, because obviously, because she can't do anything for her own mom, maybe she was hoping she could do something for someone else's mom, Because it turns out the mystical creature in this episode is, in fact, a fairy godmother, which is kind of like, I wasn't expecting that. And she brings it up later on. This is actually the fairy godmother from Cinderella, because she talks about it too. She's like, oh, like she's basically very mean spirited, because it's like, oh, I've just given and given. All those spoiled brats have taken and taken and taken. The fact of the matter is, oh, I want a pretty dress. I want to go to a ball. I mean, think about it logistically, like wearing a glass slipper. What about the blisters alone? And it's like, at first, because I was like, oh, she was referencing multiple girls. So I was like, oh, she's talking about girls that are like Cinderella. So there's plenty of girls like, I want to dress. I want to go to the ball. And then she mentioned glasses. So it's like, oh, no, you're specifically Cinderella's fairy godmother. That's interesting. So I'm guessing that's kind of supposed to kind of a wink and nod. At the very, obviously, you probably think about it too much. But in general, I guess it's supposed to be like, oh, yeah, at some point in time, there was legitimately a Cinderella in some shape or form back in the day, because apparently she got locked up for 1,000 years, like humans locked her up, and that's what this is all for her. It's like she's using prudence as like, and I even love that, because even before we even got to that, like, oh, she's like singing and stuff like that, and Ray's kind of like, oh, this is awesome, she's singing. And even when it was all said and done, it's like, oh yeah, she's branching us down with these, she's holding us down with these branches, and she's sending crows to peck out her eyes like she did the rest of the people. But hey, man, was that a catchy tune, you gotta admit. And it's like, Ray, your optimism never ceases to amaze me. But what I thought was so interesting was like Constantine, like, oh, fairy godmothers, they're like, he compared them to parasites. I was like, that's so funny. Oh yeah, and even Sarah's line of like, what in the Disney hell is this? When like I love that, like, because it's not like, oh, these grueling demonic things. It's like, no, first you had a unicorn which killed people and ate their heart, and now you have a fairy godmother who's actually very evil and wants to make people burn, because like her past, it makes it so like, oh, she's very jilted and she just wants people to burn. It makes you wonder what humans locked her up. Also makes you wonder what like the supernatural world is like in this show, like in this universe of the Arrowverse and everything that includes the multiverse. Like, what's the supernatural world like even in the multiverse? We're getting it here on Earth 1. It's crazy to think about, because it's like, obviously, like, you know, it's a whole thing of like fairy tales and folklores are based on some reality. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just kind of a meta thing to think about. Like I said, the whole Cinderella thing kind of being real, and it's just, you know, it's just this fairy tale that was based on, I don't know, just kind of, like I said, that's kind of the typical thing anyway. Like, I'm not going to get into it. That's going to be a long ass tangent. But nevertheless, even when Zari went on her own and tried to save Jane, but Jane had a very interesting perspective of like, no, I understand you're trying to do good. I know you have the best intentions, but if I go, other people will suffer. And the fact of the matter is, these people are consumed by fear, which is interesting. That concept comes over into another show, because that's a big thing this season. Well, I guess that kind of correlates a lot with Zari's story in that regard, like what's going down in Supergirl, the whole like being judged for being different. Like, obviously in her time frame, and the same thing kind of applies in Supergirl's world too. And I think that's such a fascinating thing, because it's the whole concept of like fear breeds monsters. And in Jane's case, she's like, oh yeah, but fear is what made them do what they're doing, and I can't fault them for that. All I can do is forgive them. You know, they don't know what they're doing. Don't really know what they're doing, and Zari's pleading with her, because Zari's talking about her imprudence, but obviously she's talking very much from her own personal experience of like, if you do this, I get it, you're trying to save your daughter and everything, but she would spend the rest of her days blaming herself and hating herself and the world for you dying, because she'll blame herself that she didn't do what she needed to protect you. I mean, we know what ends up happening. She burned all the people and Salem, sets them on fire, which is interesting because it's kind of like a, not paradox, more like it's just kind of a cycle, because the reason why the fairy got inspired by the hellfire is because John gave her the idea, but he got the idea from the fact that that's how this town. So it's just kind of interesting, like it kind of like a fulfilling cycle when it comes to whole fulfilling prophecy in the sense of like time travel and just like everything kind of playing like into a circle like that. So I thought it was kind of interesting. But what was really fascinating is like obviously Zari like obviously was trying to defend Jane, and we saw a darker side of her powers, which I thought was interesting. And I guess maybe that's kind of supposed to be representative of like there's a darker side to every totem bearer power. But the fact is, not only could she control wind, she could actually take the air out of him, which is very reminiscent, just kind of a make a comparison. It reminds me of Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's kind of spoilers. But water bending has a dark side to it, you know, blood bending. And it's like, it never crossed my mind to think like, oh, you'd be able to suck the air out of people. Like, I'm trying to remember if that ever came up before. I don't think it did, because it even shocked Zari, because it's like, she's literally sucking the air, the oxygen out of their bodies, making it so that they can't breathe or suffocating. and she had to stop herself because she was looking at what she was doing, because that was ultimately what she ended up telling Prudence to kind of get Prudence to stop. Was like, fear has made these people into monsters, but we can't let it make us into monsters. Because even she's like, the world doesn't get better in certain regards, but the fact of the matter is, like, you have to do what your mom would want. Your mom wouldn't want you to hurt all these people. She'd want you to forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, essentially. You know, like I said, they're all people driven by fear. I mean, that's kind of what the period frame is. Because that was kind of the interesting thing, because even Constantine had brought it up at the beginning of the episode. It was like, why would any mystical creature come here? Mysteries, as Ray put it. And then Sarah was kind of like, yeah, we're going to just go with fugitives. So it's like, okay, because there's the whole anachronisms last season. Now we got fugitives. That's interesting. I like that. I'm probably going to keep Mysteries in the back of my mind. I'm probably going to forget about it like by the next week, and I'm going to be so bummed about it. But we're always going to have fugitives, aka Mysteries, and even had Sarah going like, yeah, to Puritan to Puritan, and everyone's looking at her kind of like, Ray and Constantine are like, wait, what? And she's like, too much, right? And I was just like, because it's so interesting, because it's like, especially when you look at where Sarah started off, she was the most serious person. It's like, yeah, you see her over here cracking jokes, and it's just the nature of the show, and it's so good. It's just so funny, because she was kind of like the stoic hero, much like Oliver. So you see a much more sillier side of her, and I think that, you know, that's very like, that plays into just the aspects of the show, as it's kind of going on, playing up the comedy more, which is just like, which I think does wonders for the show. Like, it not taking them, as well as the show not taking themselves too seriously, I think is pretty neat. But in the end, luckily, Jane and Prudence are able to walk away. And even Zarya was kind of scared, because the fact is, like, she saw a side of herself that she's never saw before. But now she kind of goes, I guess all that sarcasm is just me kind of deflecting from like some deep-seated, you know, issues that I kind of have to deal with. And even, you know, Sarah talks about, like, you know, it's like, oh, the anger from like wanting to change things but can't, because she's lost a lot and she wants to change a lot, obviously, Laurel and her dad. But it turns into that thing of like, they have to find some other outlet for their anger. They'll figure it out together. So I'm interested to see what they ultimately end up finding out about that. I'm also curious to see what happens with the whole Zari's thing, because I was like, oh no, her totem's burning, she's going to lose it. And then I was like, at the end, it's like she got the stone, and I was like, all right. I was like, I'm such an idiot. That was literally the whole point last season. Like, those things are super indestructible. Like, it would take a lot to actually break or destroy them. So like a fire, it destroyed like the necklace part of it, but obviously the totem gem is still in. So I wonder, is she going to like find something else? Like, is she going to get like a new one made by Gideon, or is she going to find a new way of holding it or something? I'm just curious about that, what she ultimately does with that. It probably won't be a big thing. It might just be like a little minor thing, but still. What I also thought was kind of interesting about this episode too was the whole situation about Constantine when he was dragging the fairy godmother away. It's like, actually, you can be I'll be your host. And it's like, what? You're keeping this a secret from the team? And at the same time, I was like, that'd be kind of dope, because you had this little side thing that would constantly happen back and forth. Like, obviously, to keep it secret. I was like, oh, that'd be so interesting. But the fairy godmother's like, oh, I know who you are, John Constantine, and I know who the hell is after you. I'd rather go to hell than be stuck with your situation, you know? Even saying that even with her being dragged off the hell, she's in a better situation than John is, which is like, wow, that's interesting. I guess I wonder, is that just because she's magical, or does everyone in the supernatural world know how screwed John Constantine is? There's also like the tiara that got left behind, so I'm curious if that's going to play a role. Is that just going to be a reminder of their adventures? So I thought that was kind of pretty neat. And then on the other side of things, we find out, you know, Nate and his dad, Hank, things aren't really going great on their side of things, kind of just not really the common ground and stuff like that. Then it turns out, you know, Nate has been staying at the Time Bureau, so that's kind of interesting. He offers to help Ava, she's kind of got to, you know, go in front of a committee and explain why they need the budget they need to keep the Time Bureau going. And it turns out that this is one of the secret government projects that Nate's dad, Hank, is a part of. Obviously, Nate doesn't want to kind of take part in it. It's like, don't worry, Gary's got this. And Gary's like, my head's stuck in a tube. And it's just kind of like, And so Ava goes in there, and Gary breaks down the whole situation. But it's so interesting, because like his dad already knew about time travel and stuff like that. It's like, it's like you're okay with time travel, but you're not willing to just take the leap and jump to magic, to be fair, it kind of makes sense because in general, in this world, in the Arrowverse in general, hasn't popped up that much. Like prior to like Legends season 2 and 3, magic wasn't really that big of a part. Like only other magic out there was Damien Dark, and it hasn't really popped up anywhere else. Even on Supergirl, it's only popped up a tiny bit. So there's that whole situation as well. So, but then again, that's like one of those particular situations is fifth dimension stuff. And it's like, it depends on the continuity you go by in the comic books, whether or not that's technology or whether that's like powers or whether it really is magic. It borderlines magic, but it's like fifth dimension technology in some regards. So that's why it's kind of iffy in that regard. But nevertheless, what I thought was kind of fun was just like, yeah, Gary being like, and a unicorn bit my nip off, and he opens up his chest, and then just like you have Ava being like, and then Hank being like, all right, we're leaving. This is getting shut down. And Ava turning to him, Gary, put it away. And it's just so interesting. And then Gary making that joke of like, he's like, oh, do you need anything? And Hank's like, no, just validation. He's like, you're doing a great job. He's like, validation, got that big goofy smile on his face. And then just Hank staring at him, and Gary's just like, okay, and walking away. I love it. But then like having Nate show up. Also, did we not, why? Maybe this came up early. I don't remember. I'm assuming it's a whole Gideon thing. It's like you can understand Ray as a pig talking, which is pretty dope. Ray got turned into a pig. Rory too. Rory was off, enjoying his food, and then Ray went to go, talking to Nate because Nate's like, hey, I got to prove to my dad that this magic exists so that the Time Bureau can keep going on. And holding Ray, and when it's all said and done, Ray turns back into a human, naked in Nate's arms, and then Nate steals up and he's like, oh yeah, and also magic's real, but also I'm a superhero, so yeah, and it's like, what? I wonder is he ever going to bring up the conversation? That'd probably be a tough conversation to bring up about the whole like his dad situation of like, oh yeah, because in actuality he met his dad like back in season 2, so there is that whole thing of like, oh yeah, and actually in the time travel stuff, Dad, I met your dad, my grandfather, and actually I met you when you were a kid. You remember that dude that you talked to like during the whole space mission? So yeah, that was me. And I said, what? I don't know if they'll go that far or not. Maybe, but it's definitely going to be interesting because obviously like they are slowly working towards building their relationship. But what's also fascinating is Nate staying behind because he wants to spend more time with his dad. Even Ava offering him a job. It's like, hey, you want to spend time in 2018 anyway. So like, oh, I could actually use you here. Like, you want a job and stuff like that. You almost see Ray kind of a little bummed out leaving because it's like, oh yeah, bud, because like one of his best buds is kind of leaving. So it's kind of like, not necessarily he's leaving, but it's just kind of like, oh yeah, like Nate's not really going on the missions and stuff like that. I didn't know that. That was kind of interesting. I didn't expect that to be the case because I guess for him, it's like, this is an opportunity because it gives him a chance to kind of make amends with his, go with his family, which I didn't expect that to kind of be a storyline, and just in general that Nate would be kicking in 2018. But I guess that's also like a way of being like, oh yeah, this way we focus more on the what the Time Bureau's up to. It's going to be interesting, like seeing Nate chilling with Ava and stuff like that with the Time Bureau, like going to be like her, Nate, and Gary, and see what that means, like in comparison with the Legends and stuff like that. I'm very interested to see what the next episode has in store for us with all of this. So. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good